You're watching ZBM TV9 Bermuda.
Welcome to Let's Talk. Let's Talk aims to create national conversation on the issues of the day. Your host this evening, senior newsman Gary Moreno.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this week's edition of Let's Talk. And it might come as a bit of a surprise, but we're going to put politics on the back burner for tonight. And instead, we're joined by Ms. Debbie Ray Rivers and Mr. John Brunson, who are both executive directors of the organization known as SCARS, and that's the acronym for Saving Children and Revealing Secrets. Is that it?
That's it.
Thank you very much for being here with us tonight. First of all, what exactly is SCARS? What is SCARS all about?
SCARS is formed to really advocate for children that have been sexually abused, and also to work with the affected families. It's important, and we felt that it's important that Bermuda has someone that can represent those individuals which are voiceless in our community, typically our children. And that has been the cut and thrust of what SCARS is and what we do. And our aim is really to advocate for change. That's change in legislation, in that we hope that there will be changes in and the provision for tougher laws as it relates to the conviction of convicted sex offenders. We also work to provide education, and prevention is one of the key aspects and cornerstones of our organization, in that we can arrest the problem before it becomes a problem. And in order to do that, people have to first learn the facts about the crime of child sexual abuse, and then understand what the risks are. And we do that through ensuring that they have the proper tools to be able to make that assessment.
Child sexual abuse is not the kind of thing that people openly talk about in this country. How prevalent is that problem in Bermuda?
Well, what we know in general terms is that 1 in 4 females and 1 in 6 males will be abused by the time they reach their 18th birthday. And now, with reference to Bermuda, it's known that the collection of statistical data with reference to the crime of child sexual abuse is very difficult to find. But anecdotally, based on information that we've received from the Vulnerable Persons Unit, Child and Family Services, and other social helping organizations that deal with the crime of child sexual abuse, the instances may be even more prevalent than the statistics I just quoted. We also know that 88% of the time, the crime of child sexual abuse goes unreported, and there's a whole host of issues as to why that happens.
And that just kind of stole my thunder there, because that's the next question that I was going to ask you. Why is it so difficult to get these numbers if this is something that community, society abhors?
It's difficult because when you think about the crime of child sexual abuse, I think what the public need to know is that more than 90% of the time, the typical perpetrator is someone that we love, we know, love, and trust. And so when you talk about reporting a family member, the ramifications of doing that can destroy a family. On top of that, you don't always know what a person's socioeconomic position is. There's a dependency where the financial well-being of a household could be dependent on someone who is alleged or convicted as being a sex offender. So it makes it difficult because people are more concerned about the ramifications than they are the well-being of an innocent child. And that's our focus, and it's a reminder that we're talking about the manipulation and violation of the trust of an innocent child. And that crime, and the crime of child sexual abuse, is a life sentence. It's something that we can't do over or take back. And that trauma will be with them for the rest of their life.
Deborah, you feel free to join in at any time. You're saying that it's difficult to get these statistics because of the reasons you outlined. But are we seeing an increase in the amount of reports, or an increase, people becoming more aware of this situation and perhaps becoming emboldened or more confident now that they can come out, say what is happening, and have the problem addressed, get the treatment that they require?
Yes, I think they do. I think I think Oprah Winfrey was the first person who really came out, 10 years ago, and said that she had been sexually abused by a family member. And I think once people realized, and I know it was personally in our family because our family was affected by this crime, it made us feel empowered that if she could say this and still be loved and respected, then we can talk about it, because the issue of child sexual abuse is very shameful. It's shameful on the victims. It's shameful on the families. And so I think Oprah was really the first person who gave empowerment to individuals to say, yes, I am a victim of child sexual abuse, or I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse. So I think that now more and more people, and especially with SCARS and our awareness programs and our training and our education, people are feeling empowered to report. Children are realizing it's not their fault. And even adult victims are able to now say, it happened to me. It's why I was on drugs for 20 years. It's why I had trust issues in relationships. It's why I had an eating disorder. I think individuals are now empowered to say, it wasn't my fault. This is as a result of what happened to me.
John, you mentioned that the statistics, I suppose internationally, are 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys.
Right.
But it is thought that the statistics here may be even higher. How much higher?
Through our conversations with the Vulnerable Persons Unit, the claim is that it could be 1 in 3 females and 1 in 5 males. So that is anecdotally the direction at which the statistical evidence on the crime presently sits. So it's not a happy story, and it's one of the reasons why we really feel that it's important to talk about the aspect of prevention. As Debbie said, prevention is key, education is key, learning the facts is important, because we have to turn the paradigm on its head, where the victim should feel empowered and know that it's okay for them to talk about it, and to know that they did nothing wrong and that it wasn't their fault. And that's important for victims to understand. Far too long, the society has swept it under the carpet, and it has been taboo to talk about it rather than the crime that has occurred. And what we're trying to ensure is that the world is made to feel uncomfortable to the sex offenders, and prevention and the knowledge that we impart is part of causing that to happen. And to be honest, for a victim to really transition from victim to survivor, they need to know those important facts, that it wasn't their fault, that they did nothing wrong, and they didn't deserve to have that happen to them. Many victims go through their life right into adulthood thinking that they did something to deserve it, and that's just untrue, and we want to dispel that.
Now, you mentioned preventative efforts and the like. What is SCARS doing to heighten or educate people as to what can be done, educate families, educate parents, what can be done to assist in preventing this?
Well, first and foremost, both Debbie and I, and now we have a fraternity of 20 people that are facilitators and trained and certified facilitators in the Darkness to Light Stewards of Children certification program, which is a 5-step program which teaches participants how to prevent, recognize, and react responsibly. So what SCARS has introduced to Bermuda is the Stewards of Children certification for any caregiver that deals with children. We've also are advocating that it become legislated that anyone responsible for the caregiving of children be certified in some sort of child protection training, hopefully our stewards of children. So that's.
But you would think that would be par for the course.
We think
it wouldn't need to be legislated.
Well, we would think that we wouldn't have to, but it doesn't exist. And really, I hate to put it this way, but it is really encouraging through legislation people to be trained, because there's a lot of misinformation about the crime of child sexual abuse, and that is even in its definition. Far too often, people think that child sexual abuse relates to adult relationships with a child, if you understand what
Yes.
I mean. And the reality is that it's not just a matter of adult relationships with a child. It can be the aspect of voyeurism. It can be exhibitionism. It can be introducing a child to inappropriate adult information. And not only that, especially in this day and age, it can be soliciting a child through the electronic media. So the virtual world has created a landscape where you can be anything you want to be. And to an unsuspecting innocent child, they think they're befriending someone, a peer, when in actual fact, it's an adult who has bad intentions to first gain their trust and then manipulate the child to do something that ultimately may lead into sexual abuse. And I'll just remind you, we've had 2 cases that have been reported in the Royal Gazette recently where the perpetrator solicited a child through Facebook.
It was reported on ZBM News as well.
Exactly. There you go. So, it's important that, that people are aware of what the definition of the crime of child sexual abuse is.
What exactly is the definition of child sexual abuse? Since you're making the point that we're probably not aware of exactly what it is, we seem to have all these misconceptions as to what this crime is.
The definition of child sexual abuse is inappropriate relations with a child, either by an adult or a larger, more powerful child, where one person is exerting power over another. And it includes, but not excluded to, touch, whether it's encouraging a child to inappropriately view somebody's body, or inappropriately touch someone's body, or be asked to view or touch their own body. It can be the exposure to inappropriate adult subject matter, whether it's through video, printed media, or the internet. It can be the type of conversation that we have with children that is age inappropriate, especially as it relates to that of a sexual orientation. Yes. I'm trying to be...
I understand what you're trying to do. Go ahead.
And it is also, a matter of encouraging children to keep secrets from their parents as a result of these types of activities. And I think, generally speaking, that is kind of the broad brush approach of what the definition of child sexual abuse actually means.
John suggested, or he alluded to just now, that perhaps it's hidden. We need to expose people, or expose might be the wrong word, educate people as to what this is all about. One of the things that we've been hearing about for the longest time is the setting up of a sex offender register in this country. Is that something that SCARS supports, and would it assist at all in eliminating this problem?
I do think it would, and SCARS does advocate for a registered sex offender list. I think we have to be very careful about how we do that, because I think, and only speaking from experience, when a convicted sex offender, when a sex offender has been convicted, I think we have to be very careful about saying what the relationship is to the child, because the child needs healing, and they need that time to heal. So I think a sex offender could go on a registry after they've come out from incarceration, because they're no threat to children in prison. And I think that gives the time for a child to get the healing that they need. And I think it should be the family's decision when that happens, and because I think because this crime is attached to people we know, love, and trust, I think the victim needs that healing process, because it can be damaging to the child if, and I think that's where the shame has to come in. The shame has to be placed where it should be, which is on the perpetrator, not on the child. But I think depending on the age of the child, they need some time to heal, to understand what happened to them shouldn't have happened, and that can come in many forms. But we do promote the sex offenders registered list. I think it will protect individuals in neighborhoods or in schools. I think, though, that organizations can still do some due diligence, because from what we have been told, there is a sex offenders list. It's in the hands of the Attorney General and the police. And if I was running a school, if I was the principal of a school or a church or a sporting organization, and I was about to hire someone who was going to be entrusted with the care of children, I would call the Attorney General or the police, because you can ask if somebody is on that list, But you have to have good reason. Of course, it can't just be, you're being nosy about someone.
Pokey, as they say.
Exactly. So as it is, I mean, you could do that now. If you're running any organization that takes care of children, you could call the Attorney General or the police and find out if somebody is on that convicted list. And I think also if I was running an organization, I might want to even call Child and Family Services and see if there's any reason that is there a red flag to why you wouldn't necessarily have somebody taking care of children, if you can get that information because a lot of times victims don't go through with the prosecution process because it is very difficult for families. And so I think that they should just call Child and Family Services and see if there's any concerns about somebody that they're going to hire that's going to take care of children. Because let's face it, sex offenders will be where there are children. That's their trigger. That's what they want. That's what they're sexually attracted to. And so they're going to go to places where there are children.
All right. We're going to continue the discussion in just a bit. Stay with us.
Let's Talk is a ZBM News 9 presentation. We continue in a moment.
Thanks for staying with us. Debbie, just before the break, you were mentioning that there needs to be proper treatment, or there should be the sex offender system that does exist, that children need to be separated from the offenders, and that the child needs to be made to understand it's not your fault, you don't need to feel guilty about what happened. It has been suggested that people who engage in this type of activity cannot be cured. Is there any truth to that?
Well, it depends, I believe, in the age of the offender. Because what we try to explain to parents is, we want parents to start having those conversations about sex with their children at a very young age. And we also want them to have conversations about boundaries and respecting other people's bodies and not allowing anyone to touch them or them to touch anyone else. And if we start that early and we talk often, because when you really think about it, Gary, and let's be fair, sex feels good. If young boys and girls do not know what to do with this feeling, and no one's ever had that conversation with them, they don't know where their boundaries are. And I think it starts very young. I think if you have a perpetrator who's 20 and has been abused, and then research shows that abusers who abuse were abused themselves, a high percentage. I think if you get a young offender, and I do believe they can be rehabilitated and they could be taught boundaries and understand what it does to children and how it affects people's lives. But if you get a 70-year-old or an 80-year-old that's been abusing, or a 60-year-old, I think it is more difficult. This is it, though, in a nutshell. An offender can only get better, first of all, if they admit they have a problem. It's like an alcoholic. I am an alcoholic. I can't go work in a bar. I can't be around alcohol. I can't have a drink. And I think the same applies to sex offenders. If they really, you should be able to see a change in their heart, in the way that they, admission is the biggest thing. If they can say, I am a sex offender, I cannot be around children, and not minimize it, I think people can change. But I think it takes professionals that understand the minds of sex offenders to be able to determine that, because they're very manipulative. They have a mask. There sometimes could be a priest or a coach or a teacher, and everybody likes them. They're the best at what they do, and so they're not really there. It's not really who you think it is, because they're doing all of this stuff in secret. And so it's going to have to take trained professionals to work with perpetrators who really understand the minds and how they work. I think even before they're released, because otherwise, and that's why it's so critical that we have proper rehabilitation and counseling in our prisons, because otherwise we're setting them up for failure when they come out.
Which takes me to my other question. Do we have the wherewithal, do we have the means here in Bermuda to properly assist victims of this crime?
I mean, our perspective on this issue is that there really needs to be a holistic approach to dealing with the crime of child sexual abuse and the repercussions. And if we really want to seriously address this problem, rehabilitation for the perpetrator is critical. If you allow a perpetrator to go to jail, serve their time with insufficient rehabilitation, or no rehabilitation at all, basically, as Debbie indicated, we are setting them up to fail, because they haven't admitted that they have a problem, and they come back out, and we've heard it. You reported it in, it was the case of the Facebook incident. He was a known sex offender, but yet he was put in a position where he had access to children, and he exploited them. And so we really have to do that, and we have to be able to determine through assessment by professionals whether the individual is ready to be re-assimilated into the community. And what I would also stress in this holistic approach is that the crime of child sexual abuse is not just an individualized problem. The crime of child sexual abuse is a community problem. It's a community problem because when it is committed, the spillover effect is like the ripple effect. It resounds throughout the community. And so as a community, we have to take this seriously. We have to be honest when we know that a perpetrator has committed the crime rather than protecting them. And we have to honor that in order to continue to protect children, we need to provide the right rehabilitative services to ensure that they don't reoffend.
Go ahead.
As Debbie said, and one of the things that is actually quite shocking to people is, and I want people to really listen to this, is that larger, older, more powerful children can be perpetrators, okay? And the reason why is children are sponges. They mimic behaviors that they see. They reenact behaviors that they are exposed to, and they don't understand exactly what it is that is occurring, but they do know that this type of behavior is viewed by them and has seemed to be acceptable. And appropriate boundaries have not been a part of their teaching. And so with children, you really can address the issue through proper education and proper teaching them boundaries, teaching them that they have to respect other people's bodies and spaces. And in our training, we talk about defining the human anatomy as the bathing suit area. It's an age-appropriate message which clearly defines that that's an area which no one should touch or violate. I would also stress, just by the definition of child sexual abuse, it's not all about touch. So we have to arm them with information to let them know that there are sexual predators that exist on the internet. And just as we ask our children when they go out, who are you going with, where are you going to be, and what time are you going to be home, we need to be asking the same types of questions of our children when they're in the virtual world. Who are your friends? What chat rooms do you go to? Where are they going? And that type of detail. It's the same level of protection. We just have to understand that the risks are there and how we can better address and protect our children.
The Stewards of Children training. What is this all about? I was reading recently where it was, I think the teachers up at the Berkeley Institute, they went through the training. Of course, we had His Excellency the Governor, Mr. Ferguson as well, and his wife, Mrs. Ferguson, graduating from the program or going through the training. What exactly is this all about? What does it entail, and what is the objective?
The cut and thrust of the Stewards training is based on a 5-step approach to protecting children. But before we get to the 5 steps, it's built on 3 basic principles. Those principles are making choices. We all have choices to make. Some people choose to report, some people choose to do nothing, and some people choose to report, okay? It takes a lot of courage to report. It's easy to do nothing or pretend like it didn't happen. And making choices is built on the premise that you have to recognize that the crime of child sexual abuse exists, and you step out of the realm of denial. So that's the first governing principle. The next is to know that you have to take risks. And taking risks means that you have to step outside your comfort zone to do what is right. You may suspect or you may know that someone may be guilty of the crime of child sexual abuse, right? But you don't know what the outcome is going to be, and you feel as though there may be a personal risk if you actually do get involved and report. But, if we as adults truly honor the saying, it's an adult's responsibility to protect children, then that has to be the driving force for taking risks and not knowing exactly what the outcome is going to be, but seeing that something is done, and also following it through to see that a result is achieved. You may not agree with the result, but that a result is achieved. And then the last thing is supporting each other. What happens, and one of the biggest risks is when people decide or choose to report, they're out there on their own, and they start thinking about their own personal risks. And in today's society, we have a lot of dynamics which can force an individual not to want to report. We have the presence of gangs. We have, personal abuse to the adult or whatever the case may be, the child, threats to the family. But if you support each other, then you're not in it alone, and then the community is behind you. And the community actually takes a stand to say, this is not okay, right? And it's key that with the victim, we say that we believe you also, first and foremost. So those are the 4 guiding principles to the 5 steps. So once you accept that, then we go into our 5-step approach. And our 5-step approach starts with the concept of learning the facts. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lack of information out there about the crime of child sexual abuse. So what we really do is we ground people in what the facts really are, what the crime of child sexual abuse really is, and the impact that it can have on the life of an innocent child. And then we talk about how we minimize the opportunity. And minimizing the opportunity governs the way we behave as adults, okay? Because we have to recognize that our behavior can actually contribute to children being sexually abused. So to minimizing the opportunity says, let's look at the environment in which we exist and know where the risks are. For example, let's just say your child is in music lessons and the music class is in the back room at the end of a corridor. There's no windows on the door, and it's a one-on-one scenario between the music instructor and your child, okay? We know that statistics will tell us that the majority of the time, the crime of child sexual abuse occurs in a one-on-one situation. So as a parent, we would say there's certain questions that you need to ask of the organization or the individual that you're entrusting your child with, and there's certain elements within the environment that they're going to be left that you should expect. So in that scenario, there should be a window on the door so that it's openly observable.
But it would seem like some of these things are common sense.
Well, this is the tragedy. These things would appear to be common sense, but time and time again, we see environments that are responsible for the caregiving of children that these things are overlooked. And this is part of the message about minimizing opportunity that we provide. I mean, we did train 71 teachers at Berkeley in one instance, and we trained 35 in another. So in all total, we trained every individual that is a part of the staff and faculty at Berkeley. So the good thing about that is that they all have the same message. And they all look at their environment in which they work very differently now. So that's learning the facts and minimizing the opportunity. The next step in the 5-step approach is talking about it. Okay? And that is getting the conversation out there. And you asked Debbie a question earlier about, the reporting and the instances. We hope that because people are talking about it more, they're more able and apt and willing to report. Okay, so, and the statistics we know that Bermuda can provide is that there have been an increased instance of reporting. And so we know that we're having an impact. And so the aspect of talking about it means that you talk about establishing appropriate boundaries and the risks to your kids, but then from an organizational perspective, you talk about what the organization can do to minimize the risk to the children and minimize the risk and exposure to the staff and faculty of the organization, whether it's through procedures and controls, a code of conduct, re-engineering the environment by adding glass windows on the door, rather than having one student in the class with the teacher, and if they do, the door's open, anyone can walk in, or you combine classes so that, there's more than one child. And we also espouse the premise of 3, 2 adults. It's the rule of 3. 2 adults, 1 children, 2 children, 1 adult, 3 children. Okay, and that also helps to minimize the opportunity.
All right.
And talk about that. There's still 2 more principles.
We're going to have to continue after we take this break. Okay. And when we come back from the break, we're going to open up the phone lines. Unfortunately, our receptionist is not here tonight, so we're going to do as best as we can, make do with what we have. And the number for you to call is 599-3385. That number again is 599-3385. It's a cell phone. We're going to put you on speakerphone, and let's hope that this thing will stay with us.
Let's Talk is a ZBM News 9 presentation. We continue in a moment.
Okay, we've just tested the phone and it does in fact work. So it's 599-3385. John, just before we went to break, you were talking about some of the principles, some of the
five-step approach
Yes.
to protecting children. And the last two principles is recognizing the signs, which is important. We provide training that teaches people to recognize the signs. And there's a lot of signs and symptoms that can be present in a child that has experienced the trauma of child sexual abuse. So as adults, it's important to recognize the signs. And what we say is the instance of one may not indicate anything, but the presence of many is an indicator that you should stay alert. And the presence of many may not necessarily mean that sexual abuse has occurred, but the child has experienced some sort of trauma that would lead to really wanting to investigate further what has happened. And then the last is reacting responsibly. We, as adults, need to model our behavior in terms of how we react to the crime and the issue of child sexual abuse. And that has to be from a perspective of acting responsibly. It's important to know that the way we respond and the way that we convey messages to our children will really determine how they interpret the message. If we are very negative and angry when we're talking about, a sensitive subject matter
Yes.
like sex and touch, they'll interpret it as something negative and bad. But if you do it in a way that is nurturing and explanatory and embracing, they receive it that way. And so when we talk about reacting responsibly, how we react is really important in terms of how our children receive the message, but also to ensure that if we're talking about it, the message is age appropriate and that we're always seen to be doing the right thing. And so those are the 5 steps in our entire training program, and we build a lot of detail and examples and stories from professionals, from survivors, from the law enforcement, from counselors that really help to reinforce the subject matter that we're presenting.
One of the complaints that we often hear is that, let's call them by name, the police service, they're not in tune, they're not sensitive enough to matters of this nature, issues of this nature. Is this something that SCARS is looking into addressing and hopefully bringing the necessary education into agencies such as the Bermuda Police Service?
Well, our experience with the Vulnerable Persons Unit has been very positive. At the time when SCARS was first formed, Inspector Clark, Telemac, was very quick to send his staff from the Vulnerable Persons Unit to become certified in the Stewards of Children, Darkness to Light Stewards of Children training. So that has not been our experience. What I would like to say, where I think we do need we could have, encourage improvement, is with the judges, and to be more sensitive to the victims, and to understand that there is a spillover effect from a child that has been sexually abused, and to be very sensitive to the victims. I think that to have a victim get on a stand and have to relive what has happened to them is very traumatic, and it can be just as bad as the abuse itself. And so I think that we need to get to a place where children tell their story in a very nurturing and their experience in a very nurturing environment. Instead of on a stand with a screen, I think we have to think about a more nurturing and caring environment when it comes to children, so that children are encouraged, that they want to say what happened to them. But I think right now it's just very intimidating. And if they're not empowered by a family member or someone in the system that can empower them to say, this was not your fault, you did nothing to cause this, and this is a crime, and what happened to you wasn't your fault. And I think just empower them to get on the stand and to have people that are caring and nurturing to do that. I think it makes a big difference, and I think we have a long way to go when it comes to
Good evening, caller. Go ahead. You're on there. Go ahead, caller. You're on there. Hello? Okay, I guess we've lost that call. The number to call again is 599-3385. We're having a bit of a problem with our telephone system here tonight, so we're trying to do it through the cell phone, 599-3385. I know I asked this earlier on, whether there was sufficient... Hello, caller, are you there?
Yeah, good evening.
Yes, go ahead, please. You have to listen via your telephone and not the television, please.
All right. I was at a netball game a few weeks ago, 8 and 9 year olds, and my wife and I were sitting from quite a distance looking at this game, and we saw this young child sitting in this man's lap every once in a while, and she'd get up and walk off, and it really didn't look right to me. So I went and down to a lady that I knew was the teacher, and asked her about the situation, and she says, "Oh, that's his daughter." And I just, like, the way I was answered to him has made me feel like I had done something wrong. And that has been bothering me ever since. I was blessed to look at your program this evening and know that I didn't do nothing wrong, but the situation just didn't look right. Because even if it was his daughter, the other kids looking on would probably go ahead and do it and not even know what they're doing.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, my response to that is I would celebrate the fact that you and your wife were alert to something that did not look appropriate. And we have a saying which is, it's better to offend an adult than to fail a child. And basically, in your scenario, you were actually looking out for the best interest of the child. You found out that it was her father. Again, this speaks to, making choices, and you made a choice, and you were determined to see that a result was achieved. And as I said earlier, it may not be the result that you expected, but at least you knew that a result had been done, and you should feel proud in yourself to know that the well-being of the child was your motivation, and you did what was in the best interest of the child, and I would celebrate that. You shouldn't feel that you did anything wrong.
Is that situation the normal occurrence though? Or is it that people are just afraid to get involved, not my business, has nothing to do with me, turn my back, walk away?
I think societally and kind of historically, we have been very dismissive about inappropriate behavior. I mean, many a times you'll hear people go, "Oh, don't let your child go around that person because they're not good with children," or we know that. But nothing has ever been done if that person is really a suspected sex offender to really address that problem. And what we've found is many times, there was one victim who came to us and said he was offended by someone in his neighborhood and he thought he was the only one. Only as an adult did he find that this particular person had attempted to do what they did to him multiple times. And this speaks to the statistical support of what happens. The typical offender offends between 1 and 9 victims, and that's about 70% of the time.
1 and 9 victims?
1 in 9 victims. 20 to 25% of the time, an offender will offend between 10 and 40 victims. And if this individual is left unchecked, the perpetrator can offend in excess of 400 victims, classified as a serial sex offender. Now, whilst those statistics may be alarming, there are very present examples that we know of that will really support that. For example, at the University of Penn State, we know that Jerry Sandusky had in excess of 40 victims. Okay? And there was a whole support network around him that decided to sweep it under the carpet and conceal the truth. But the truth will set you free. We also know that in the UK, Sir Jimmy Savile offended in excess of 300 victims over the life of his career with BBC and talent shows. And they too chose to conceal the truth. So when we think about sex offenders and how our behavior contributes to people continuing to offend, by not reporting, you're really enabling the offender to offend more children.
Go ahead, Cole, you're on the air.
Hi, good night
Good
to
evening.
everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I was listening to the first caller when he talked about the child sitting on the father's lap. Okay, what I want to know is there a system in place for parents who know that the abuse is happening to their child and they're not doing anything about it? Because, most of the time, You know, a mother might have a boyfriend who's supporting the family, and she can't do anything about it because that's the only means of income. So is there a system in place for parents who know it's going on to their child but not doing anything about it?
Okay, thank you very much, ma'am.
I think, unfortunately, the way the system works at the moment is that if the parent and the child are unwilling to bring the case forward, then there is no case to answer. And that's the tragedy. And the law doesn't provide for the police to take the responsibility away from the parents and advance the investigation. And we think that that is one of the things that's required in terms of legislative change, is that knowing that a crime has been committed, that if the parent is unwilling to protect the child and remove them from the environment in which they're being abused, then the child should be awarded to, in the custody of the state, if you will, and an investigation conducted, really to protect the child and other children.
But isn't there legislation already in place for that to happen? Because from what I've been made to understand, if a child goes to the hospital and it's suspected that there's some kind of wrongdoing, it has to be reported. If a teacher sees something suspicious, they also have to report it to the authorities?
Well, all caregivers of children are mandated reporters, so they have to report. The authorization to examine the child and report that data still flows back to the parents. Now, if the parents are deemed to be, unsuitable for the role, there is an option to award them or transfer them into foster care. But that's a process that has to happen. But the police and Child and Family Services do have to get involved, and an assessment does have to be made in order for the case to advance.
Go ahead, Cole, you're on there.
Good evening, Gary, and good evening to your panelists.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening.
Gary, I had to commend you on this topic. It's a great topic.
Thank you.
I have one question. What is the appropriate age to start talking to your children about sex offenders?
Thank you very much. And I think that's the question of the night. What is the appropriate age to begin talking to your children about matters of this nature?
Well, our training says 8. 8 is great, is what they say. And I think it needs to just start with talking about what private parts are, not to give pet names. I think, in generations have been having pet names for the anatomy, and it's an uncomfortable topic, so we want to make it as easy and simple as we can.
Possible.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we should start with, let's call body parts what they are. And if I can say it, we have to say a penis is a penis, a vagina is a vagina, because it can be very dangerous if a child is wanting to report and not using the proper body parts. Then the professionals don't have the language to use to know what they're really talking about. So I think that's the first conversation to have, and sometimes it's even important to have that before they start developing, so that they're excited about what's coming. And then I think also, the boundaries, and it is an uncomfortable topic. We get asked all the time if we have a program that we can take into the schools to discuss with children about sexual abuse and their bodies, but we think that conversation needs to be started at home, and it's not just a one-time conversation. And SCARS has been blessed enough to have a donor that donated books to our lending library, so we take books to our PTA meetings that we speak to parents, and so that it makes it easier for them to have a conversation, to read the book with the child, and it helps enter into that uncomfortable topic. But in the training, they encourage 8. 8 is great.
But what I would also say to that point, Gary, as well, is I would also encourage parents to start early and talk often, and that the conversation has to be age appropriate. And so as your child, first of all, the parents have to establish a relationship with the child to really have that type of conversation. And you start early in a very healthy way, and it must be age appropriate. And so, by the time they reach the age of 8, they have a good grounding as to the fundamentals and the tools to protect themselves. We know that a child that says, no, I'm going to tell my mommy or daddy, to a perpetrator, the perpetrator will leave them alone for fear that they'll be caught. And so if you empower your child at the earliest possible age, they'll be able to protect themselves. Unfortunately, a perpetrator that is thwarted by a strong child will move on to a less strong and more pleasing child.
Good evening, caller. Go ahead. You're on there.
Yes, good evening, Gary. Good evening to your panel.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Okay, let me turn on my TV over there. Okay, I heard you guys throwing out a lot of statistics and stuff earlier.
Yes.
I'm trying to find out if there's overseas statistics. I think he said like 1 in 3 boys and something like 1 in 3 girls. I'm not sure if I got it right, but I'm trying to get the statistics for Bermuda.
And that is what...
actually see if how much men we're looking at or how much women are doing this or what age brackets we're looking at and stuff like that. If you can give me a clarification.
Sure.
Thanks much.
Okay, first, I'd like to start with the latter part of your statement, which is, basically who the perpetrators can be. First of all, the crime of child sexual abuse doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter what your socioeconomic standing is. It doesn't matter what your education level is. It doesn't matter what your religious background is. And it doesn't matter what your race or political beliefs are. It just doesn't matter. It does not discriminate. The typical offender can be anyone. It can be a male, and the statistics will prove that a large proportion of offenders are males. But it also can be women. We know that 25% of the time that's reported, a perpetrator can be a woman. But we also know that offenders can be larger, older, more powerful children. And we know that statistically 40% of the time, larger, older, more powerful children can be offenders. Now, with reference to the statistics that I quoted, 1 in 4 and 1 in 6 originally, those statistics are not Bermuda statistics. Those are statistics that are provided by the Center for Disease Control in the U.S., which is the repository for the collection of all data with reference to the crime of child sexual abuse. What I did also say is that through our discussions and meetings with organizations in Bermuda that deal with the crime of child sexual abuse, that being the Vulnerable Persons Unit, that being Child and Family Services, that being the Center Against Abuse, that being the Women's Resource Center, that being the Family Center. Anecdotally, we know that the crime in Bermuda is more severe. And that is also supported by the statistics that come out of Interpol, which say 1 in 3 females and 1 in 5 males will be offended by the time they reach their 18th birthday. Unfortunately, Bermuda does not have the vehicles to collect that statistical data at the moment. But I have no doubt that that is changing and that will continue to change as people become and as they become more empowered to talk about the crime and trauma of sexual abuse.
I find that difficult to accept, that Bermuda does not have the vehicles, as you suggested, your terminology, to gather this information. Go ahead, caller, you're on the air.
Okay, Gary.
Hello?
Yes, hello.
Hello?
Surprised I got you guys back.
You're going to have to speak up, sir.
My follow-up question was, I was caller just now.
Yes, go ahead.
My follow-up question, I'm sorry, I'm glad you got back.
You're going to have to hurry up. You're only allowed one call, sir. Hurry up, please.
These guys out in the open, can we do something about putting these people on the spot? Because, I mean, to deter other people from doing stuff, we need to put some people out on the spot.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
I mean, what I would say to that is we rely on the printed media to really name and shame. Any sex offender that is convicted, the crime should be revealed in the paper. So, for example, the Facebook incident was reported in the Royal Gazette, and many other convicted pedophiles were reported in the Gazette. We do think that in the reporting there should be a sensitivity to the victim, and what really should be reported is that Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so is a convicted sex offender, and the sentence. It doesn't need to reveal any more information than that. And so, yes, we do think that it needs to be exposed because it better arms the community in which we live as to who may be create a risk for our children.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, the crime of child sexual abuse has been going on for generations. So this is no secret. It's just that the topic of sex has never really been that comfortable to talk about. So, it was, he interferes with children, just keep it quiet and protect your family. But the danger in doing that is perpetrators will continue to offend. It's not like they have a bad day. Let's be clear. What they're sexually interested in is children. So if one child says no, or if that family doesn't report it and keeps the child away from that perpetrator is only going to go on to offend other children. So we have to speak up. We have to report. We have to move the shame from the victims and the family to where it needs to be, which is on people who make choices to hurt children.
Mm. You were saying, John, and I was saying that it bothers me that we don't have the vehicle to gather the information and correlate it, disseminate it here in Bermuda. Why is that? Because if you're saying that people are becoming now more empowered to come out and say what is happening to them, why is that not possible?
Well, it is possible, but you have to...
Why is it not happening?
I mean, that's a good question. I think that, societally, as I said, the spillover effect of the crime of child sexual abuse affects everyone, and that data needs to be captured. I know that both Debbie and I are working with an organization that is now charged with reporting statistical data, and so they're developing the repository to collect information just like that. So it's happening, but from our perspective, we'd like to see it, move a bit quicker because there's a child being offended every day and reoffended every day. I mean, we have many instances where a victim can be offended from the age of 5 to 13. So we really need to move aggressively in addressing this issue.
Go ahead, Cole, you're on the air.
Yes, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My question for this evening is, do we have a support group for the survivors of sexual abuse, men or women? That's what I would like to know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Not one-on-one, but a group.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we do get asked that question quite often because what we're finding is adult victims are now telling their story. We're hearing more about adult victims who have been in pain for years and have hidden their pain, masked their pain, more than we are hearing about children. I don't think it'll be very difficult to really measure how many children we're saving. But we are saving a lot of adults who are finally telling their story. So the answer to your question is, and I wish I could say yes, we're working on it. Through the Women's Resource Center is working on a survivor group of people that have been sexually abused, but it's for women. We do not, sadly, have an organization that really helps support men in Bermuda, and I would love to see someone
Well,
do
do you
that.
think that is? Does it have to do with this whole
Shame
machismo image and...
That's part of the problem. I mean, societally, it's thought when a female offends a male, it's almost like a rite of passage, and as a male you've arrived. But what we know now from clinical reports, from clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, is that the trauma of sexual abuse, whether it's a female and male or male and a female, is exactly the same. And to the point earlier, we know that the spillover effect doesn't present itself just in the offense that's been committed. And organizations like the Center Against Abuse, the Family Center, the Coalition for the Protection of Children are dealing with people that have experienced trauma or that are still being victimized. And many times, it stems from the initial crime of child sexual abuse. So whilst many other social organizations are dealing with societal problems, it can be that it's stemming from a fundamental cause, which is the crime of child sexual abuse. We know that, typically a victim that goes unassisted will either resort to alcohol and drugs and become an abuser, may resort to self-injurious behavior, may become promiscuous as a teenager. It could lead to teenage pregnancy, and it can ultimately lead to the worst possible outcome, which is suicide. And so when you think about the crime of child sexual abuse, the crime itself is tragic. But when left unaddressed, the spillover effect and the alternative methods of behavior are seen as deviant behavior, and we can't understand why. And this could be a cause for that.
Good evening, caller. Go ahead. You're on the air.
Good evening. With that in mind, we should have a hotline for victims of child sexual abuse and ones going through it. Because treatment facilities and services are expensive, and the Women's Resource Center doesn't cater to, well, initially, boys and men going through it also, who may have like a ego or whatever. So I think we should have a hotline where someone should just be able to call whatever time of the day to express or to report sexual abuse.
Thank you very much. Good suggestion.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good idea, but I don't think it's enough just to stop there, because many times in our experience, when a victim makes a call like that, they're really looking for help and they're looking for support, and not just, a recorder at the end of the telephone line. And that is what SCARS, by default is becoming, is a helpful voice to those people who are looking for guidance as to what they can do or somebody to talk to. And we have seen many times that adult victims, are revealing for the first time the pain that they've been carrying for years. We were on the Sherry J show. We had a 46-year-old male who called in, and to hear him tell his story, he resorted to addiction. He developed an addiction to heroin, and he's been fighting almost his life to kick that addiction. But the way he talked about the abuse that happened to him at 46 was almost as if it had happened yesterday. And, that's the tragedy is with many adult victims. And I do agree the helpline would help, is that the journey from victim to survivor is a very difficult road, especially with the lack of help.
You're going to have to stop. 30 seconds. How can people get in contact with you guys?
They can either contact us through our website, which is www.scarsbermuda.com, or they can call our direct line at our office, which is 297-2277, to reach us.
And that's where we're going to have to leave you for tonight. Sorry, Debbie.
That's okay.
God bless, and thank you for viewing. Do have a good night.
Let's Talk is a production of ZBM News 9.